Hey, everybody, welcome back to another one of our exciting vodcast episodes. Today, we have Teresa McFarland, who's joining us from Colorado, and she is with Thrive Collaborative, which we're going to spend some time talking about that and its many different name iterations over time and how that has really influenced everything that they're doing in the community. Teresa, thank you for coming on and talk with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to have the conversation.
Yeah, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about who you are, your journey, how you got to be an NDBI practitioner?
Yes. Yeah, I think this will probably resonate with a handful of you out there. And especially, I've been practicing for over 22 years now. And when I first started, I was in undergrad and I was starting as a psychology major and knew that I wanted to work with children, but wasn't quite sure in what capacity. So from there, I saw a flyer just in our department around working with a child with autism or diagnosed with autism at that point. And so I contacted the family and reached out. And when I started working with that child, I was amazed. I was so intrigued with how their brain worked and just all the joy and interesting complexities and how they saw things. And so I was hooked. And I started a nonprofit group at my university to try to connect students working with families in the community. So I did that for the 4 years that I was an undergrad, and we ended up working with many, many families and 40 to 50 students by the time I left. And so I was very motivated to keep figuring out how can I be a part of this community. And yet I had just stumbled onto it and worked with a few people through these volunteer opportunities, but nothing formal. So I ended up applying to a low-VOS replication site at the time. That was where most of behavior analysis was working for kids with autism. So I was at a low-VOS replication site in Ohio, in Columbus, and stayed there for 2.5 years or so and really learned kind of the basics, the foundational pieces of a lot of behavior analysis. And we did pretty traditional ABA there, as you would expect. And I felt like I learned a lot. And pretty early on, I was recognizing there was a bit of a disconnect of what I was being taught to do with the children and the disconnect of their engagement and their motivation. And at the end of the day, their generalization, especially outside of the clinic, outside of pretty traditional discrete trial and to families. And that felt hard for me. So I decided to go back to decided to go to graduate school, go back to school. And I realized I don't know much about education. I don't know much about the broader field of autism. And so I applied to the special education program at Vanderbilt, which also had,
Wow.
yeah, so it had a
Lucky.
it was, yeah, it was wonderful. I applied at a few places, but I really fell in love with the program at Vanderbilt. And so I went and studied under Mark Woolery and Ann Kaiser and a lot of really incredible people in the field of autism. And they were practicing more from a special education lens. And I felt like, well, this is something I don't know as much about. Let's see if maybe the answers that I'm looking for are there. So I was there for quite a while. I was there for about 2.5 years, and I was a mentee of Ann Kaiser. And so I worked on her naturalistic language project. And that was one of the first experiences where I started to delve into naturalistic teaching and realizing, oh, when there's motivation and children
Yeah.
are using and wanting the things that are in their environment, communication comes naturally and we can support that. And so I worked as a therapist on her research projects and then a parent coach. And until I graduated, did my thesis with her and on naturalistic language teaching, and then was lucky enough after graduation to work with a company who was doing naturalistic therapy. So they were doing behavioral therapy, but with a naturalistic lens, and did that for 2 or 3 years. And then we decided, my partner and I, we moved out to Colorado, and I met up with Diane Osaki. She is one of the original clinicians that worked alongside Sally Rogers at JFK Partners. And so they did a lot of the early work on what at the time was the Denver model.
Yep. I
Yeah.
remember
So
that.
exactly. Yeah. So there was a whole group of really incredible clinicians working together here in Denver. And over time, after Sally moved out to Mind and Diane kept practicing in the Denver area, that's when I moved to Colorado in 2010. And so she was running a nonprofit at the time, and I applied and started working as one of her program coordinators for the early childhood program. And I came at this perfect time. They were shifting from more open-ended behavioral therapy to using the Denver model, the ESDM model in earnest. And so we had trainings with Lori Vismara, and of course Diane was supporting and consulting, and one of our other incredible SLPs, Helen Nitschke, was a part of the program. So we worked together for 3 or 4 years there, and then we split off and decided to start Thrive. So Thrive is a small independent company that provides behavioral therapy, but with a very developmental lens and relationship focused. And we use ESDM for our younger clients, and we use many of the philosophies and tenets even with our older clients. And we go into all the natural environments. So we do parent coaching and supports in schools, and we also have a clinic. And that's how I landed here.
Oh, what an incredible journey. I feel such parallels with you from
Oh,
starting
sweet.
out in the 90s
Yeah,
in Iowa when there was
right.
word replication that would come out, and it was the
Yes.
same thing. I talk about it
Hmm.
a lot. The little boy that I supported in a room in the office with a chair and a table with no
Yeah.
toys, and all he wanted
Yes.
to do was get out of the door. And then he
Right.
ran out one day and I went to find him. He was upstairs in this glorious playroom, just
Oh,
playroom full of toys. And I was just
right.
to the mom, can I go up there? Do I have to stay at the table? And she's
Yes.
like, I'm fine with it. If the supervisor from Cardiff,
Right.
she was wonderful and was like, yeah, you can teach anywhere.
Great.
And instead of running away from me, he would run to me. And I was like,
I
this is it.
know.
I
What a
cannot do
difference.
right. And I was
Hmm.
20 or 19 at the time. It was a long time ago. And so I feel that same very much journey of
Yeah.
I love the science of ABA, but I'm not feeling this application or how it's applied in these contexts with these young children isn't
Right.
feeling comfortable to me. But I don't know enough about development at that time to know
Yes.
why it didn't feel right.
Yeah.
Then went to school, and my master's was in Ohio State in applied behavior analysis with Tim
Hmm.
and Coop, but it was in the special education department. So it was very
Yes.
kind of a different feel.
Right.
And then kind of pulling that out, and then I
Hmm.
went to work for Dr. Partington. So I got into verbal behavior and net,
Hmm.
teaching in the net. And I was like, okay,
Yes.
a little closer to what I'm feeling. Like I'm almost
Right.
there, no whammies. I
Yes.
got into PRT and ESDM, and I felt home.
Hmm.
And I'm like, okay, this is where I think
Right.
I'm meant to be.
This
I'm
fits.
very happy. The children
Yeah.
feels like we're doing things for the right reasons at the right
Hmm.
time in the right context with the same incredible science. So
I know.
I love that journey for you. And I love
Hmm.
Anne. She's
Yes.
amazing. She came on the NDBI Connections conference that we had in October. She came on
Oh,
and taught it
lovely.
hers, and it was just incredible to listen to her share her knowledge about
Oh,
dose considerations.
yes.
And Connie had talked about some of the work they did for Jasper and EMT.
Hmm.
Like,
Yes.
I'm learning more about these other ones over
So
here.
exciting. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. She was an incredible mentor to learn from. And I think our focus was language, but even just the shift of thinking about what are kids motivated by? What do they want to communicate for? And it's such a difference in really thinking about communication more than only tacting and manding, and more about let's think about where's their motivation and all the different ways that as humans we communicate. So I learned so much from her, and was really excited to be a part of the parent coaching piece, because as we know, there's involvement, but it's what parents' involvement looks like and how that varies over time depending on the program is vastly different. So
Oh,
having parents involved in a meaningful way, and them being the primary providers of the therapy in a very play-based way that didn't feel like therapy for parents, they still got to be mom or dad,
yeah.
was just such an eye-opening experience.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that myself as the parent.
Yes,
4-year-old
absolutely.
boy
Me
with autism
too.
too.
Yeah.
Looking at that little Liam goes to preschool, and
Yeah.
maybe once a month might get a note from the
Right.
SLP teacher. We worked on L today.
Right.
Great. How would you like support that. What's true,
Yes.
when I look at that 25, 30 minutes he gets of speech once a week, not being generalized, not being carried over to the home because we
Hmm.
have no clue what they're doing. And it's kind of
Right.
like that marble jar where that's like one teeny marble
Yeah.
of all of this that my husband and I could be filling with support
Hmm.
in a routine-based, language-based, play-based kind of model to support
Yeah.
that. But we can't do
Yeah.
it. We don't know what that is.
Right.
So it's so
Right.
important that parent coaching and those partnerships for
Yeah.
any OT, SLP behaviors, all of it. I think it's
Absolutely.
so incredible. Do you want to share what your dissertation was on? I'm curious. Can you
Yeah,
remember?
I do. Oh, I sure do. Yeah, Ann and I talked quite a bit, and I ended up doing a generalization project with parents. So I looked to see when I would do parent coaching on naturalistic language teaching. So I taught EMT, which is Enhanced Milieu Teaching. When I would teach those concepts and topics to parents, they they would be working with an at-risk SIB. So they had two children, at least two children. One of their kids was diagnosed, and then one was at risk, um, not simply by being a SIB, but they also would go through some at-risk assessments that I did. And so if they were considered at risk, then I would teach the parent these EMT strategies to use with their child who is at risk.
Okay.
And then I ended up after teaching the topics to see would parents generalize those skills to their child with autism? And then also would they generalize skills to different types of routines? So maybe we would first teach and play, but then I would see can they generalize to book routines, a lot like ESDM.
Yeah.
So it was really a generalization study to see not only can I teach the topics, which we had pretty solid evidence on EMT that parents were able to learn EMT and they were able to do these strategies, but could they generalize to a child where they hadn't directly been taught? And then could they generalize to these different types of routines? So that was my thesis.
There. And the results were
The results were
good.
generalization didn't happen naturally, which actually was really helpful to recognize. But with one, for the most part, one or at most two booster sessions, they were able to generalize both to their child with autism and to different routines. So I think that that's such a great clinical application of we can't assume
Mhm.
generalization happens even when you have 12 weeks of solid coaching. The
Yeah.
jump to generalization, whether it's activities or different children, is actually pretty different for a lot of parents. Children are different, as we know, different activities have different components. But I was very encouraged that 1 to 2 booster sessions directly with that child who hadn't been taught or the other routines was enough for parents to reach the criteria again.
That's incredible. I was
Yes.
looking for something. It was something Anne had. I don't know if she talked about it at the conference. It's available, I think, on Vanderbilt's website,
Mhm.
Kid Talk,
Yeah. Yep. That's the EMT
downloadable.
project.
Yeah,
Yeah.
resource for free for people.
Yes, I
I'll have
know.
to
It's
put a
such a
link,
great project.
yeah, to Vanderbilt
Perfect.
for learning about that. I don't
Yeah.
know if Anne has any books. I don't know that I have any books on EMT in my library.
Right.
Published. Are there any that you're aware
Not
of?
not that I'm aware of. She's published many articles, so she does so
Yeah.
much research, but I don't believe she's published a book. I think that would be lovely. I
Oh,
mentioned to Sally and Diane early on, so much of the language pieces in ESDM mirror a
mm,
lot of Anne's work and Paul Yoder's work and some of the
yeah.
naturalistic language. And I think EMT even takes it a little step further. So some of the knowledge and things that I learned with Anne, I apply in ESDM, but it's not as detailed or hasn't yet been as detailed in the model. And so I think
Yeah.
having more resources around that would be lovely for everyone.
Think so. I think you need to unpack that for us. What would some of those be that
Right,
you
right.
I know they're redoing the manual, the
Yes,
manual
yes.
summer possibly coming out.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think
that's
the language
exciting.
chapter was a big part of it, my
Hmm.
understanding. So what would
Yeah.
be some of those things that EMT brings in that can enhance ESDM from the language
Yeah.
perspective?
Yeah, I think ESDM gives the global, like they hit the mark globally, but I mean I don't know what you find, but when I teach the workshops or when I bring people through certification for ESDM, the adult language piece and teaching multiple communication functions, those two pieces of fidelity are really difficult for adults. It's difficult for adults to change their language behavior, to not ask so many questions, to use declarative versus instructive or other questions. And so EMT really goes into the depth of thinking about and Sally talks about this in the appendix, but thinking about how do we expand language, so language expansions, and even going further back to how do we simply observe, and then what Anne would call mirroring, so basically watching and imitating.
Oh,
And then they kind of go through this hierarchy of really starting early on with observing and then imitating, and then we're starting to expand language. And then at the very end of training, then we're talking about prompting language. Whereas
mhm,
I think many of us, either behavior analysts or those that were taught more traditionally, we go straight to prompting
yeah.
instead of really thinking about how to build motivation and how to join. It's a lot like the play partner
Yeah.
decision tree that we talk about
Yep.
in ESDM, but it's
Uh-huh.
much more detailed from a language perspective and thinks about language in a different way rather than a behavior analytic way, or it just goes more in depth. So I think it gives more information on what does it mean when we're talking about language expansions? What does it mean to ask less questions and to
Yeah.
prompt multiple communication functions? I think a
Yeah.
lot of that is new vocabulary and new language for at
Mhm.
least behavior analysts, and I think many
Oh, for sure.
practitioners coming to ESDM.
Absolutely. And I agree. Those are two of the areas that I tend to see from my trainees that come in through certification or work
Yes,
that come from a behavior analytic background.
right.
They're struggling with that. And it's
Hmm.
like, here's a visual job aid. Here's what that looks like.
Yes,
Unpacking it for them. Most of them are like,
right.
okay, oh, yeah, it makes sense. But it's just in
Hmm.
conflict with either what they were taught or
Right.
no teaching. They're just kind of coming
Yes,
in and they're excellent behavior shapers.
of
But
course.
off is how
Mhm.
they're shaping those behaviors and the timing of when. And I talk a
Yeah.
lot about the little ones that I often see who are not initiators,
Mhm.
not given the chance to initiate. It's so
Yes.
cult driven
Yes.
speaker
Mhm.
versus listener. If we think about it from a
Yes.
behavior perspective, they don't get
Exactly.
an opportunity because we're not using
Right.
purposeful pauses. We're not scaffolding for
Mhm.
them.
Yes.
And they're the kiddos that respond beautifully, but they never
Yes.
spontaneously initiate and don't.
Mhm.
Because
Yes.
they're not given the chance to. So
Yes.
within like our framework for
Yep.
ESPM, that we are
Mhm.
looking for that to really make sure that this is co-constructed and that we're both
Yes.
equally what I would call a listener and a speaker,
Mhm.
having these beautiful conversations, which is for me like
Right.
art, the conversation. You have a setup, a theme, a topic,
Yes.
right? And then you kind of
Yeah.
digest them, you say goodbye, and then you wrap it
Yes.
up together. So it's this beautiful dyadic back and forth. And that's very different from how I started out with adult directed,
Yeah,
really kind of
same.
driving the bus, if you will, and the kid was just
Mhm.
kind of along for the ride, as opposed
Yeah.
to the child and I are taking turns driving the bus and we're going on the same route
Right.
together with the same
Right.
focus and goal. And that is so much fun and enjoyment and
Yeah.
motivation that comes along on that journey compared to
Mhm.
the other journey that I've
Yes.
done before.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the strategies when you go back to the science of communication and thinking about EMT and a lot of other naturalistic language interventions, they really think about how do we build motivation and space for kids to communicate. And like you said, we're thinking about it one, we need to do more what we in language intervention you'd call time delays, or we
Yeah.
might call them expectant pauses. And so
Mm,
thinking about giving both just the actual space, like not adults taking 3, 4, 5 turns in a row, but giving space. And then also thinking about how do we set up children to be initiators rather than only responders. And, the listener speaker type dyadic that you were talking about, really thinking about that in a almost like a long game
yes.
lens, because we're not as interested in the immediate, do they respond to my question, do they respond to my instruction? We're interested in teaching them to be active, engaged initiators, and that's a hard skill and it takes a lot of time. And how we
Mhm.
get there is typically through narration and tacting or commenting and building the foundation about talking what they're interested in, and giving
Yes.
them space to talk about that, and let them know, I see you, I hear what you're interested in, I want to hear what you have to say. And as adults, I think we're used to, even as a parent, we ask questions because we want to hear their voice, and actually asking questions can be a punisher. Yeah,
Mhm.
it can reduce kids motivation, and so it is a more of a long game and a long process,
Yeah.
but definitely worth it. And I think one that's a pretty big shift for most adults.
I absolutely agree. And I really appreciate you saying kind of see them, hear them, and meeting them
Yeah,
where they are. As a professional doing this forever, and now as a parent, it's really
right.
important to kind of support everyone's individual preferences and honor their
Absolutely.
autonomy. And, assent is a big topic of the
Yes,
ABA right now. And kind of what
right.
does that mean? It doesn't mean you don't put any boundaries or
Of
expectations.
course.
But we're talking about
Yes.
toddlers. They need boundaries.
Right?
They need expectations.
Yes,
I
yes.
can't fathom a world where a 3-year-old was allowed to do whatever
Oh,
they want
I
anytime they
know.
wanted to. So I think it goes back to that, for me, that understanding of, um, I try to always talk about kind of child-centered, because if I talk
Mhm.
child-led, that already kind of puts some people off with,
Yes.
oh, you follow the child around.
Yes.
No, no, that's child-run. That's not what we're
Right.
doing.
No.
Child-centered. There's a
Yes.
difference. So I feel like I spend a lot
Mm.
of time clearing up myths and misconceptions. We
Yes.
really got to the heart of it. Like, we're trying to kind of meet that child where they are, understand them, learn with them, learn from them, in
Right.
addition to teaching them. And I feel like sometimes professionals just, I got a goal, I got an objective, I got to get it to the payer for review, I got to get the data.
Mm.
To
Yes.
me, it's how you get the data is more important than the data point. Like, you got it
Absolutely.
prompted and it didn't generalize, it's still a data point. It's not a good
Right.
one, as opposed to
Right.
setting up conditions in the environment that are really going to
Mhm.
get us that maximized, efficient, generalized learning that we're looking
Yes.
for. And
Yep.
so I really appreciate you sharing that viewpoint and
Yeah.
seeing that.
Yeah, I think I agree. In those workshops, it's been such a privilege to have those conversations with practitioners of their misunderstanding at times of ESDM, of like, I thought it was child led. Like, we can have boundaries. We're not following every whim of the child. And so we have that conversation of developmentally, of course, and ESDM would also agree. So thinking about, I think Diane and Sally use the term more child inspired, but I think child centered is another great way to think about it. And so we're really thinking about what are the motivations and where
Yeah.
will learning happen most efficiently, because if we can get that hook, as we talk about in
Yep.
ESDM, and we can build motivation, then our
Real.
learning tends to happen so quickly. And so spend the few minutes or even longer getting engagement and getting motivation, and then learning will happen. It's so common for adults, because I think it comes from a place of caring, of I want to teach, I want them to learn, I want to have the data to show their progress. And sometimes we skip all the early steps of, yeah,
Yeah.
but we need to build the foundation and scaffold to even get buy-in and engagement.
Yeah.
And
It's kind of
that's
like you
really
said,
where,
the long game,
yeah,
right?
the long game. Yeah.
Long, big
Hmm.
picture kind of view versus
Yes.
that smaller one of,
Yep.
when I was looking at ESDM, when I kind of stumbled upon it, oh God, forever ago. I had stumbled upon it through PRT and then looking at some of the social motivation research
Hmm.
and the social attention that Jerry Dawson has. And I was looking at that,
Right.
and I was fascinated by the brain development, and I'm like, this is interesting. And then I got into the social motivation, and Chevalier and colleagues kind of laid out a paper where they really define and break down this construct of social motivation,
Mhm. Yes.
orienting seeking, right? And I was like, aha,
Right.
the light bulb
Yes.
going off. And I was like, okay,
Right.
really into this model, because the entire
Mhm.
model is kind of based on that premise. I'm like, this just
Right.
makes sense from brain
Yeah.
is to application, that the whole thing is focused around attention and motivation. And if we don't have that, yeah, you can teach, but how long might it take, and how many
Right.
trials contrived might you have to do, as
Mhm.
opposed to kind of setting up the conditions for that? It's like magic for me how
It
fast these
is.
children are learning. And
Yes.
no, that's not scientific, but I'm telling you, the differences of children's responses between
Right.
style of teaching and this style, for the majority of the children that I've seen, is just day and night.
It
Um,
is.
but what you do, if you do something and you're motivated by it, you're more likely to do it again. You find it fun,
Right.
reinforcing, you're likely to seek it out. So that
Mhm.
recipe for success is just built into NDBIs, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think NDBIs really focuses on how do we give context and meaning to learning, which, especially in a more discrete or traditional model, sometimes we we take out the meaning for kids. And so without them seeing meaning, it's hard to build motivation. So making it contextual to their interests and thinking about
Yeah.
developmentally, where are they and where are their phases of learning and that zone of proximal development. So
Mhm.
yeah, to me it makes total sense. And I also recognize it's a big shift. It was a big shift for me, even though I experienced, felt, and saw the data of like, oh, this makes sense. It's pulling together so many fields of science that really create this great, comprehensive,
Yeah.
effective model.
Oh, I agree. We can preach all day about that.
Yeah. Yes.
What do you find in the community? So community practice that you're in,
Mhm.
center, schools, natural settings, in the home.
Yep.
What does that look like? And what kind of challenges do you encounter kind of trying to implement? And do you get pushback still, or no, people are becoming a little bit more open and receptive to this model?
Yeah. So as far as ESDM, there is such receptivity. I think, many of the families that reach out to work with us come to us because they're looking for ESDM. And I think certain practitioners who are starting in the field, there is a new awareness and it's starting to even be talked about in graduate programs. And so the model itself, I think there's for the most part a willingness to learn more about it.
Mhm.
We so in the homes, I find that when we work in homes, families are typically very receptive because we're teaching in a way that replicates what their day-to-day looks like. And we're asking from the get-go, what do you value? What do you care about? What should we be supporting you all with? So rather than going in with an assessment that's standardized and saying, okay, this is the next target this child needs to learn, we're really gathering information, but then their programming is built on family values and culture and
Mhm.
what is developmentally appropriate. So it's a little different than 20 years ago when we were going into homes and we would come with a pretty scripted program for all
Mhm.
kids. And so it being individualized, it being play-based, and play-based meaning naturalistic. And so that means we're teaching in snack, we're teaching during diaper change, we're coaching them through difficult transitions into the car, and we're teaching at the museum. So that has been welcomed. And I think that's been such a gift to see families feel like, oh, this is what we're talking about. It was scary when we had a diagnosis and they said behavioral therapy, but this I can get behind. And
I
so again, how you practice behavior analysis can look very different. And so that's been very well received. What
good.
I think is probably the hardest is this is pretty focused on behavior analysis, or at least BCBAs, but there's still in Colorado, and I would imagine other states, we have a reputation. BCBAs don't have the most positive reputation, and I think a lot of it is well deserved from
Oh,
years of going in and doing pretty traditional, um,
mhm.
not as individualized programming. And although it was effective, and although we really stayed true to our science, I think we didn't do as good of a job as we could have on collaborating. And so when we do experience pushback, it tends to be in schools and it tends to be with providers who have had negative experiences with other BCBAs or other behavioral companies who come in and have a very strong opinion on how or what should be taught. And so rather than gathering information and having discussions and really truly collaborating, they are shutting down teachers and insisting that things are done a certain way. And so
Mhm.
that tends to be where a lot of our time and effort is spent because it's meaningful to create true authentic collaboration in the community. And I think that takes work. And sometimes we're starting from a place of closed doors because of the past. And so we're really trying to work hard to open the doors and get in and show them that it can look different and it can be much more co-constructed, essentially, like really
Yeah, I was
evenly,
just gonna say that.
yeah, evenly conversed on everyone's thoughts and ideas at the table.
I love that. I love that. And yeah, I think that there are so many providers. I think I'm just old, so I always date myself like the young and I think the board has put out what 50%, more than 50% of the certificates are certified within the last 5 years.
Yes,
For
I
me, that's
know.
babies teaching babies, right? And I'm coming from
Yes.
like brick and mortar building in the
Right.
90s, like
Mhm.
a whole different kind of process when it was brick and mortar
Right.
before they had online courses and online this and all of this
Yes.
technology that we've morphed into. But I still see some of that pushback. We do it this way because it works. Well, just because it works doesn't mean it should, right? Just because you have
Yeah.
the science to make a change doesn't mean
Yep.
it's developmentally, contextually meaningful. Should I
Mhm.
shape a baby into rolling over? Well, possibly, but why would I do that? Could be a safety risk if they can't roll back
Right.
in the middle of the
Right.
night. So I have the science to do it, but it doesn't
Yes.
mean it's appropriate timing to work
Right.
that skill. And to
Yeah.
think about kind of the developmental, the big D and NDBIs that really focus on developmental of learning.
Hmm.
I have a 2-year-old, right? They're oh, what's to a near zero rates of tantrums for a 2-year-old. Like that's what they do. They're becoming
Yes.
independent. They're learning
Yeah.
about boundaries. Like
Right.
not a realistic expectation. Or
Yeah.
there's 3.5. That's due back and forth turn taking. He'll be a good sport. 7. We're talking 7 before that kind of skill
Right.
develops. So while we have these great kind of assessment curriculum guides that kind of
Hmm.
help lay out developmentally, maybe a projection, not all of our kids follow that with their little spiky
Right.
profiles. But to me, it's the context. Again, what's
Yes.
matters is what are they doing, what's relevant and meaningful or
Hmm.
socially significant, we could say. And
Yeah.
it's that second A in applied behavior analysis that I feel like is really kind of
Hmm.
helping out. The analytical component, just get
Right.
checklist, do the next thing.
Hmm.
What about behavioral costs? What about this skill is more meaningful and more impactful than
Yes.
all of these? You're wasting
Right.
time. This is not going to get you generalized efficient learning because they're missing prerequisite collateral, right? That
Yes.
to me clinically is, I don't see a lot of that happening in the field.
Right.
I don't know if you encounter that in your practice or
Yeah.
collaborating with other people outside.
Hmm.
Why would you do that? Yeah, you can, but
Yes.
right, that big
Yes.
long-term, big picture view again is
Right.
what we stumble
Right.
back to.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's a common it's difficult because many of us were taught, even when we think down to the details of like generalization, there's a
Mhm.
common standard, I think, in most schools of 80% across 3 days. And so we think about, well, why 80%? Does that make sense for this kid? And is 3 days enough for it truly to be fluent and mastered? And so having conversations that are not meant to point out what's right and wrong, but let's talk about what's helpful for this class and what's helpful for a kindergartner and what
Mm,
is even reasonable for this teacher to implement, because we can have the
100%.
most beautiful science-based evidence-based plan, but if it's not something that the teacher can carry out, then it's not worth thining about or putting into place. And so really it does need to be a collaboration where we think about, yeah, developmental cusps and what the context looks like, what's most pivotal for this classroom, where are the pain points for that teacher. And I
Love.
think the same applies to parent coaching and working with parents as well. And
Absolutely.
it's an exciting discussion. There's no black and white answers about it. It's really just having conversations with people to figure out, where do we start, where do we begin, and then we bring our science and what we know and developmental knowledge into the conversation as well to create the most effective plans that are also socially significant and meaningful.
Yeah, which is so important for Thrive Collaborative, right? We're collaborative.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
love you guys have
Yeah.
that in
That
your
was
name
very
now.
intentional. Yes. Yeah,
And then
we do. I think there's so many, as you and I were talking earlier, there's so many incredible clinicians in the Denver area, and many people have been doing this for years in different types of fields, and recognizing that we want to be able to collaborate. We want to just keep opening doors rather than us all being in our own silos. And so thinking about, we know the science of adult learning, let's collaborate and let's build bridges instead of everyone working individually. We know in ESDM, with it being multidisciplinary, that's the most effective for all kids. So that was very intentionally chosen when we started. 5 of us started the business 11 years ago, and we thought long and hard about what we would call ourselves and why. And that was the
yeah,
decision.
I
Yeah.
love it. And before we got on recording, we had talked about it. We
Mhm.
started Thrive Autism Collaborative.
Right.
You
Yes.
changed that. Do you want to unpack kind of
Did. Yeah. Yeah. We started as Thrive Autism Collaborative. And we, in the beginning, especially because many of us, Diane and I, are both certified ESDM trainers, and many of us were certified in the model. And Helen Anichka, who's one of our speech therapists, was very well versed and very well known in the autism community. So many of us were kind of autism specialists. And so
Mhm.
we decided to start the company, and we thought this is mostly going to be our population that we work with, and that's where we were most comfortable and most passionate about it. And over the last probably 5 to 6 years, we've just realized ESDM and just a lot of our focus on collaboration and relationship building and trauma informed care and assent building, we really realized this isn't only autism. This isn't the only autism community that could benefit from this. So many different neurodiverse individuals could benefit. And so really expanding to think about, yes, we could work with this neurodiverse individual, or of course we could work with this child or this teenager. And so realizing that we wanted to expand past autism and really think about more the neurodiverse community at large led us to think about, should we still keep autism in our name? And especially for those that, for some, identity is really important, and they gladly hold being an autistic individual. And for others, it's either a journey or something they haven't formally gotten diagnosis around, or they have a different neurodiverse diagnosis. So we ended up shifting to Thrive Collaborative a few years ago, keeping the parts that we thought were still most important. We want all beings to thrive and have a quality of life that's aligned with their values. And we also really want to focus and kind of center our practice around collaboration with others.
I
So
love that.
that's where we landed.
Yeah, I love
Yeah.
it. I'll put the website link for everybody
Yes.
to go through
Thank
to check
you.
it out and
Yeah.
learn more about it.
Yep.
Do you have any resources that you would share, or how you stay up to date on NDBI?
Mhm.
Do you read the articles? Do you find things online?
Right.
What
Such a
tips
good
or
question.
advice would you have for people who are wanting to learn more about
Yes.
EMT,
Mhm.
NDBI in general, any of it?
Right. Yeah, there's a couple things I recommend. I think one, so I heard this years ago, and I can't remember the practitioner, but when I was at a CEU conference, they recommended going, like signing up for alerts when journals would come out with
Oh,
essentially like their table of contents. And so for probably the last 15 years, I get alerts for many of the journals that come out, and I can at least see the table of contents. And so from there, I can decide, oh, this article would be really relevant, or that's very interesting. I've never learned about that. So signing up on different journals that you would subscribe to and getting those alerts for their table of contents when they published, I think that's a nice way to at least be aware of what research is coming out. And then you can select individual articles. As far as specific resources, I think I tend to be the black sheep of BCBAs, where I do read quite a bit of behavior analytic articles, but I also encourage people, especially with ESDM in mind, to think more broadly. So
yeah.
even as simple as, if you don't know much about development, go observe in a preschool, volunteer with other children in your neighborhood, like getting to know development, observing in preschool, see what 2-year-olds do, see what tantruming looks like for typical neurotypical 3-year-olds. And
Yeah.
so general developmental resources. I also tend to encourage people to expand to learn about works that are related, but maybe not behavior analytic in nature per se. So a lot of the books that Dan Siegel has written, we learn a lot about, and I encourage people to learn about motivational interviewing and stages of change if we're going to have any meaningful conversations with parents and teachers and community stakeholders. And of course, I think all the ESDM articles are very helpful and supportive. There's some very exciting research going on around group ESDM and parent coaching. And so I stay up to date on those, but really thinking about, what aspects of my practice do I not know as much about? And what do I want to learn more? And what pieces are missing? And,
Yeah.
we probably 8 or 9 years ago at Thrive, we made a pretty big effort to learn more about ACT, so acceptance and commitment therapy. And we've been doing more with motivational interviewing now. So trying to weave in related fields that just help bolster our practice and what we see as a need day to day from the work we do.
Yeah, that's such sage advice to just kind of step outside the box of there's so many
Yeah.
very analytical articles, but again,
Mhm.
need is to learn more about contextualized learning or motivation
Yes.
or attention, right?
Right.
Developmentally appropriate practice. There are so many
Mhm.
organizations that have developmentally appropriate practice guidelines that you can
Yes.
just get for free online. You don't have to be a member.
Right.
You can just learn
Yeah.
about if you don't want to get out a big book. And I'm always looking for podcasts. Like, is there a
Yes,
podcast
podcasts are great.
to
Yes.
kind of find out like
Yeah.
kind of developmental norms, right?
Yes.
Our kids don't kind of follow those. So how do we
Right.
align it all? And just really
Mhm.
understanding what you don't know, you go out and
Yes.
seek a bit more. And it's absolutely okay for you to do that.
Yes.
Encouraged for you to do that. And
Right.
if you are that practitioner kind of flying solo,
Mhm.
definitely want to do that because you don't have that
Absolutely.
multi or interdisciplinary team to rely
Yeah.
on. you don't have to be the expert in everything, but I do think a human, supporting another human, you kind of need to
Mhm.
understand who you are supporting, basic
Right.
understanding of autism, child development, especially if you're like 0 to 4, right?
Yes.
That tiny 2-year-old is not a smaller version of a 4-year-old. Big
Yes.
there. So being able to
Right.
understand that really puts that context into those goals and objectives aren't going to be the best thing for the
Right.
child right now. And I don't know, again, that we kind of get that from our field,
Yeah.
get that from over here in the dark side,
Yes.
dark side of
Yeah.
on the light, like go to the dark side, like go over there.
Yes.
Okay. They're friendly. They'll welcome
Yes.
us and
I
just bring it
know.
back over and use your science.
Yeah, I think one of the best things we can do, especially if you're a behavior analyst, is really become bilingual. And so thinking about we have our terminology, which is incredibly important. And when other behavior analysts, I will use it occasionally, but more often than not, thinking about what's the language that's shared, whether I'm talking to a parent or a speech therapist or an occupational therapist. And when we don't speak from a bilingual perspective, I think we shut doors that we're not intending to do. And so thinking about all
Yeah.
the other fields that have information to offer us. I think, right now we've had many conversations, our team at Thrive, about Gestalt language processing and how fascinating that is. And that's really shifted, even though I have a really strong language background, that's shifted how I think about language and what early on we used to call kind of repetitive or echolalic language with no meaning. Now I'm seeing it in a totally different reference and frame of light. And so thinking about this is actually incredibly useful information to pay
Yeah.
attention to from the child and how can we build their gestalt language processing system in a different way. So again, it's not traditional, it's not what most behavior analysts would think about, but thinking about what are other fields doing that could relate to our science and how can we integrate it in a way that really makes even more meaningful
Absolutely.
progress for kids.
I love it. Oh, it has been so much fun to chat with you today.
Yes, you
Thank
too.
you again for coming on. I can't wait to
Yeah.
post it for the listeners so they can learn more about Thrive. I'm going to put
Yes.
links to EMT, and I love the
Perfect.
thought of doing the alerts.
Yeah.
Or you can do Google alerts as well.
I'm sure, yes.
So that's a great recommendation. I'm going to do that for myself.
Great.
So I can get those alerts because I do a student.
Yes.
It'd be so
Yeah.
nice if you just pinged at me.
I
Could
know. It's much more
yeah.
helpful. Yep.
Great recommendation. Oh, thank you again,
Yeah.
Teresa. I appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Thanks for the conversation.
Welcome.